So yes, I'm Rick Wilson. I'm a senior engineering geologist with the California Geological Survey. I run the CGS Tsunami unit in California. Our primary partner here in California is the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, but we also partner with a bunch of other tsunami experts and overall planning specialists at different levels of government, academic, and private companies levels. But first, I'd like to really thank Althea for inviting me to give the webinar. I do appreciate it. And in all honesty, unless there's a slew of questions and a really good heated discussion at the end, I don't see the webinar going on much more than an hour, hopefully. So everybody get an hour back, or you can go home early if you like. I'll give you permission. But with that, let's start. So over the last 15 years, especially since the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, we've seen a number of tsunami events which have demonstrated the need for improved planning to better address tsunami issues, not only after a tsunami, but before and during a tsunami. In California, we try to address these different issues at all levels of the disaster planning cycle. And we were part of a study with the U.S. Geological Survey in 2013 that found that a large tsunami scenario from the Alaska subduction zone hitting California could put hundreds of thousands of people at risk and cost the state billions of dollars in damages and lead to years of recovery. And the study, despite giving us this bad news, it also found that with improved pre-disaster planning and mitigation efforts, you can greatly reduce the impacts, up to 80 to 90% in some cases. So this was really useful information, and it's kind of been our goal to try to do as much as we can at these different levels to try to get to that level. And really, I can't think of another hazard. There's very few hazards where you can plan ahead like this where the benefits can be that significant. But I want to stress, just when it comes to debris and sediment management, this is one of those critical issues where taking action before, during, and after a tsunami can make all the difference in reducing the impacts. I was personally inspired by the Oregon Debris Management Workshop, which was held in Astoria several months ago, and I appreciated Althea inviting me to go there and talk and take part in the workshop. And it's really given me some insights into how we can better help our communities with debris and sediment issues. How can we develop products and guidance that will help with the pre-disaster mitigation strategies and post-disaster response and recovery? And I want to stress that, pre-tsunami planning and mitigation activities will reduce these hazards. And it can really put a dent in the time and the money after the tsunami in the recovery mode. So a little bit of work done in the beginning can go a long way in the end. So today I'd like to offer up for discussion and feedback and possibly even collaboration, a two-level approach to debris planning. I want to discuss some of the analysis methods that are available for determining the amount and the impacts of debris, and possibly at the end request that's putting together a work group to start the process of building a guidance document that might help our states, especially on the West Coast. So with regard to the two different levels that I'm talking about today, here's a slide that shows those two different levels. And although I'm not an emergency manager or debris specialist, I've spent a lot of time around them. After 2011 tsunami in Japan, I took part in several post-tsunami survey teams, both in California and Japan, and observed two different scales or levels of tsunami debris and sediment movement and cleanup. I'll go through this a little bit more detail in the talk, but basically there's a clear difference in the magnitude of the amount of debris and sediment, the types of the communities impacted, the official groups that are tagged to help with the cleanup efforts, and responsible for those cleanup efforts, and also the timing of the cleanup. So, and I spoke to a lot of my colleagues during that time in those groups, that were recovery specialists, and based on this experience, they kind of had discussed a kind of a two-level approach when it comes to this. So the first level is the lower level, and it's what would be considered a non-inundating event where only harbors, ports, and bays are impacted. And this would likely be a smaller scale event from a distant source tsunami with more than an hour's travel time, so there's a little bit of lead time before the arrival. And the best examples of this would be from the California and Oregon coast experienced during the 2011 Japan tsunami, what happened in Crescent City and Santa Cruz and Brookings Harbor in Oregon. But for California, you know, the groups that we were most involved with and I saw that took on the responsibility for debris and sediment cleanup were the individual harbors and ports, the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, and our Office of Spill Prevention and Response. And especially the Coast Guard and the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, which we call OSPR, were the most involved in that work. And then there were others at Cal OES and FEMA that also assisted the state with you know, state and federal declarations, and also helped with funding the cleanup efforts and recovery. So that's kind of the first level that I'm going to be talking about. The second level is a higher level of tsunami debris and sediment management. And this is really what the workshop was focusing on, was kind of a Cascadia event, very large event offshore. Or it could be even a large distant event that has an impact statewide. So those would be two different types of events that might fall into this category. I think the impacts and experience from Japan in 2011, as well as the U.S. experiences with recent hurricanes and the disaster recovery are pretty good examples for planning. And that planning and response would include not only the partners that we talk about in level 1 maritime, you know, the maritime groups, but also a much larger role from the on-land environmental cleanup groups and especially FEMA. So in both of these cases, pre-planning and mitigation activities would greatly reduce these impacts and delays in recovery. Basically, knowing more about what these impacts are ahead of time and preventing them will go a long way in recovery overall. And so I'm going to talk about trying to analyze some of those impacts at these two different levels also. First, next I want to kind of show what these tsunamis look like. This is one of the best videos I found that was available after the 2011 tsunami, showing the inundation along the Sendai Plain in Japan. It really shows the devastation. It shows the capability of what a tsunami can do once it goes on shore, and why it picks up so much debris. So here you see the tsunami coming on shore. You see that no longer is the tsunami just water. It's basically a mud flow that's going on land. And because of that mud and the viscosity of that mud and the weight of that mud, it picks up these houses and everything in its path with much more ease. And so that debris just rides along on top of that mud flow, if you will, that tsunami coming on shore. And the only time it really kind of stops and can be stopped is if there's some vertical structure or something that stops it, like here we have an elevated road that stops the flow, or it just runs out of juice, runs out of energy as it goes inland. And what you'll see is that all this debris just gets pushed into where that end is. And the debris and the sediment, and it's just a mixture of everything. And it's very devastating for these communities, which basically existed just an hour before. And this is what a large-scale tsunami looks like. So keep that in mind. And this is 10 hours later, 2011. On that same day, the tsunami arrived along our coast, the west coast of the U.S. And this is a video from the harbor at Crescent City from a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter. And what it basically shows is that fluctuations of water going in and out of this small debris base, this small basin where the harbor is, There were some pretty large fluctuations in the water levels, up to 16 feet from peak to trough, and it created some really strong currents as it moved in and out of this small boat basin, up to 9 knots. In response to the tsunami coming across the ocean, 75% of the vessels actually were able to evacuate the harbor before the tsunami arrived, and this actually greatly reduced those impacts within the harbor. I wouldn't recommend most boats go offshore, but when you have a fishing vessel that can go offshore and stay offshore for a long period of time, or has the ability to travel up and down the coast to different ports, harbors that might be safer, then that it might be a good idea to get those boats out of these harbors. But this is only for a distance source event. We don't want to try to do this during a local source event. This narrow opening where that water jets in caused a really large whirlpool, and the debris and sediment accumulated in the center of that large whirlpool that was formed within the small boat basin. And all the docks got damaged, and most of the remaining vessels were either sunk or heavily damaged. And you can see how that whirlpool kind of looked on the right-hand side in the image, with the arrows going around and basically depositing everything in the middle. And this is what the harbor looked like on the left-hand side, the picture after the tsunami. You'll note that the oil slicks on top of the surface, a lot of debris around the edges, but also debris in the middle where you get the real shallow area of the harbor now. And we were able to look at pre and post bathymetry inside the harbor, which showed a large mound of sediment that got within 3 feet of the surface, and that was just an immense amount of sediment that was deposited inside this harbor. So you can imagine they faced not only having to deal with the debris and getting it out of the water, but also trying to handle the sediment input and get that out of the harbor as well. And there were a lot of conflicting environmental and regulatory issues that popped up early on, which delayed the process a bit, but it took basically 3 months to extricate the fuel and remove those sunken vessels. It took about 5 months after the tsunami until they started actually sampling the sediment inside that small boat basin and determining how to sample it. And then it took a whole year for them to remove, after the tsunami, to remove that sediment out of the small boat basin. So we're talking a year time just to remove the sediment and get to the harbor back in a place where it actually can be rebuilt. And so you can imagine not only the issues with losing the boating community during the tsunami, but after the tsunami, many of the boats who found other harbors, and it took several years for them to rebuild this harbor, stayed away. They ended up staying at these other ports and harbors, and so Crescent City is still not at full capacity. So there's this domino effect of not only having to spend more money to rebuild, but also losing money by not getting the clients coming back to the harbor. So the faster that these harbors can be rebuilt and try to sustain and come back, the better it is for not only the fishing community, but for the community in general. So just to kind of summarize some of those debris issues that we saw in California in 2011, really there was no inundation of dry land, or very little. There was strong damaging currents inside the harbors, and this is what caused a lot of the debris. The debris was basically damaged docks and free-floating vessels that were moving around inside these harbors, and there's a picture down at the bottom of what some of those free-floating impactful ships look like in that's Santa Cruz Harbor. So they become basically projectiles inside the harbor at that point. There was a lot of scour and sedimentation in some of the ports and harbors, and that took some time for recovery, primarily because the contaminated water and the debris and the sediment really delayed the process. So those multiple year delays in rebuilding some of these harbors led to the loss of business and financial problems And if that can be planned out ahead of time and try to get these, as I said, get these harbors back in working order in much more quickly, then the recovery process and the more resilient process of those harbors can be met. For debris at the higher level, when you have a local event like the Tohoku event in Japan, there are basically a lot of findings that came out of that. This document I've shown here, the front cover of from the UN Environmental Program, is a really good document that summarizes some of the first year issues that the Japan area went in and faced during this time. But the key problems that they faced were finding and handling and identifying the remains. That was first and foremost, and something that was ongoing for years afterwards. But having that process in place at the beginning is vital to the community. And then also identifying items that had been moved very far from the original location. It was really difficult to identify the ownership in some cases of some of those items. The tsunami mixes up and it deposits these different materials, making separation difficult. As that debris sits there in piles, the salt water starts to corrode and deteriorate the debris. In a tsunami like this, you'll get a lot of that lighter debris floating out to sea, and that's why we saw that some of that debris coming across the ocean and affecting our coastline over a period of time can happen. And again, I keep referring to this as debris and sediment issues. I really want to stress that pay attention to the sediment issue, because it can be up to 20% of the debris in some areas. And it can also be some of the more difficult materials to clean up after a tsunami. So overarching, some of the management recommendations that not only came out of this document, but also some of our experiences in California, is planning and mitigation activities ahead of time can greatly reduce impacts. I'm going to say that a number of times throughout this talk, but really stressing that is important, and following through on that is important. Estimating the waste volumes early on, and I'm going to show you some tools that maybe can help with that ahead of time, and providing that consistent and centralized technical support for recovery and debris. Dealing with the debris is important also. Keeping the transportation of waste to a minimum. That was something that was brought up during the Oregon workshop. Don't try to move it too far inland because it's more costly. And if you can, try to clean that waste and reclaim it and refill the land in some areas where tectonic subsidence has occurred, especially in the local events that happens. Determining if and where sediment should be moved. And Crescent City's issue was that they had to determine the makeup of that sediment. If it was too fine of grain and it had too much contamination, they were going to have to take it to a landfill or deposit it in some other environmental place onshore, which would have been a lot more costly. It turned out that the material was more sandy and the contamination wasn't as high over that period of time. So maybe some of the volatiles were released over the delay. They were able to deposit a lot of their material offshore, which is more beneficial and less costly. The managing of hazardous materials, providing consistent environmental monitoring. One of the big things that came out of the Oregon workshop was also that financial support to the municipalities. Having a plan in place ahead of time is what I believe FEMA requires to be able to get funding for recovery on some of these issues. So making sure you have that debris plan is important. If you can coordinate local employment, that's better. Many smaller communities in Japan lost a lot of their youth over a period of years because there was no work for them. If you can employ that youth and keep them in the communities, then those communities can have a better chance of coming back. And then the process of optimizing and reducing the bottlenecks, especially the regulatory, knowing about those ahead of time and planning for those is vital. So I would like to transition now into talking a little bit about some of the tools that we have available for looking at debris and sediment transport. And this kind of goes to that pre-planning stage. Is the more information we can gather ahead of time, the more we can mitigate some of those issues through either direct mitigation or land use planning, the better the community will be off after the event. So some of the things that we can do is we can try to determine what the sources and the types and the volumes and concentrations are, where the primary source for the debris and sediment is coming from, where it'll end up, what types of and how much debris will impact important community sites, like critical and essential facilities, what debris causes environmental and contamination issues, what are the costs and resources needed to remove the sediment and debris after the event, and can this debris and sediment movement be controlled, reduced, or mitigated ahead of time? So some of these tools help with that. For California, we are in the process of developing what we call harbor improvement reports, which can help with mitigating harbor hazards. But two of the parts of this report are to model debris movement and model sediment movement inside the harbor. So we've incorporated these into this document. And on the left, I'm just going to kind of let it move for a while there, but on the bottom is a movie kind of showing the debris coming out of smaller harbors, which are likely sources for that debris inside the Port of Los Angeles. And the Port of Los Angeles themselves, larger ships, most of those should be safe during smaller tsunamis, but these the coming out of the smaller boat basins can affect those interior channels and waterways where the larger boats go. So if you block those waterways and takes time to remove that debris in the water, there are much longer delays, and the Coast Guard is really interested in this kind of information because it gives them a better idea of what to expect and where debris is likely to end up. And I can't stress it enough, especially for a place like the port, where it's kind of the lifeblood of a community or even a region. In this case, Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach are two of the most major ports for the U.S. Angeles. For one day, it can have an impact across the nation of up to $1 billion in trade and transport reduction. So making sure that they can get it back up and running after an event like this is really vital to not only the local area but also possibly nationally and regionally. From a sediment standpoint, we've run some models with our group at UFC to determine where sediment will be eroded from and where it will end up, and looked at several different scenarios. And so Harbor can get an idea of what to expect, where that sediment will be an issue, and then possibly work with the dredging operators to reduce the amount of sediment that might feed into these harbors ahead of time. And have a much better idea of reducing that impact ahead of time. So there are things that the harbors can do to reduce the impacts from sediment and debris. And we're hoping that some of putting these things out in these documents can really help these harbors. For the level 2, the bigger event, the debris and sediment movement and assessment tools that are available, in the ASCE 7-16 work, which is the Association of debris in a built environment, and using a particular scenario to come up with an idea of how many buildings would be affected, but also how much debris would be let loose in an event like this, and possibly what the cost of that would be. So HAZUS is a possible tool that can be used to get that assessment. Another great presentation was by Dan Cox, and forecasting, basically using probabilities, hazard levels to analyze debris volume and location. Some really good work there that can pretty much demonstrate over a period of time, especially for a local event area like the coast of Oregon, what you might expect for the amount of debris you have to deal with in a certain size tsunami that might be impacting that area. So, you know, not only looking at the earthquake aspect, but also bringing in tsunami aspect, and looking at the building and fragilities, curves based, you know, on determining if those buildings will sustain the tsunami or earthquake, or become debris. That's the kind of thing that can be shown here, and then also where that debris could end up if it affects, you know, some of these critical facilities on land. And then I just want to also point out that Althea and I, and probably maybe others on the call here, are part of the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. And through that program, we're going to be having a workshop here in the next year that will be looking at sediment and debris movement and the models that are done for that. So a lot of these assessment tools we'll be looking at in more detail and providing that information in a usable way for local communities. So next, I want to talk about another approach that I've seen more recently, and this is something that was provided to me by Patrick Lynette at the University of Southern California. He partners with us on a lot of our maritime work. But he is working on different visualization tools of debris movement and impact. And this may be something that could be useful for the ASCE work going forward, but also can be useful for communities to use this type of modeling. So we know that debris is strongly tied to types of flow and the convergence of that flow. When it gets carried on land, it becomes grounded. But instead of kind of looking at it from just a standpoint of the amounts of debris and where that might end up, looking at areas of influence and the concentrations of debris in those areas of influence is a way to kind of get a better picture of where debris will end up going and what could impact the site from a particular debris field. So he's developed these, what he's calling heat maps, and it's just areas of concentration, if you will, that can help improve the sediment and debris movement planning, determine, and basically be used to improve land use and mitigation strategies going forward. So the next couple slides, I not only find this very useful, but I also find it really intriguing from a visual standpoint. So I thought it'd be fun to share with this group. We're going to look at a synthetic debris movement model from an event off the coast of Chile, a scenario which happened in 1751, and it's kind of a unique part of coastline. Has two different areas of where water comes on shore, two different inlets, and the way those interact really kind of demonstrates how these models can be useful to show the pathway of debris going through there. So this is kind of the bigger picture of what the model looks like, and the size of the tsunami in meters on the right as it's coming on shore. So that's the model of the tsunami. And the next slide, hopefully I can get to it. There it is. It shows kind of the debris movement analysis approach using this model data. So what he did was develop a model that had tracers or particles with no mass Didn't allow for collision of the different particles, but basically they move with the tsunami. And so you can think of these particles as debris throughout the area, and gave basically a tracer every 100 square meters, and so there are like 1 million of these dots in here, these tracer dots. And he started moving them once the current velocities got to about 1 to 2 meters per second, which is about 3 to 5 knots speed. And once those dots moved, if they got to an area that was less than 1 meter, they would be grounded and then picked up again if it got to the flow depth was greater than 1 meter. So that's what it looks like from kind of a distance there, but this is what this debris field would look like a little more close up. And you can see the eddies that are formed, and most of that debris changing directions as flow comes in from different ways, different areas. And that debris field, you can see most of the debris just gets pushed along the edge of the tsunami as it enters land there. And so it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. This kind of visualization is useful by itself. But he took it a step further, and he basically created a grid of 100 by 100 meter regions within this area, and the computer counted how many times the debris went through that area and where that debris came from. So this is what he calls a heat map. It's basically showing the concentration of particles of flow in the flow, and basically this is identifying the areas where most likely would be affected by the debris during the tsunami flow. And although it's not shown here, we could statistically evaluate the amount of debris in each one of these flow streams, as you could see them coming on shore. So now you can see where these flow streams are going back and forth, and where the most significant impacts of that debris would be located, and the concentrations would be located. So using this type of methodology, he then ran a model that looked at different locations within this plane that identified a starting point for the debris and a pathway of where that debris would end up. Where are these particles likely to go? And so that's what's being shown here, and I'll stop it just so I can talk about it here. Hopefully. There, that's a good stop. So this debris point, the black dot, is where that starting point for the debris is. And then the color scheme basically shows the percent chance of where that debris will end up. So what I envision when I see this is, okay, we have a harbor or some other boat or something along the coastline, or something that would be free floating, maybe a tank or something. And where would that end up? What areas would that impact along the way? And that's what these concentration heat maps can show, is that potential for where they will be impacting along the way in their flow. And I think that's just a great tool, and something not only visualization-wise to be able to see it, but also to take this information and say, maybe we don't build our tank farm in this location because we know this debris is going to end up back in this other area where we have a higher population, or something to that effect. So it can be used for land use planning also. So the other way to look at this is not only from a standpoint of where the debris will start and go, but if you had a site, where would that debris impact come from? So here, let's look at this site here. We have a black dot that's inland, and this shows where the debris is coming from. So let's say we had a hospital in this location, and we had some environmentally problem or potential problem areas along this pathway. What would impact that particular site is that black dot, and then along that color concentration really shows where the impacts will be. So We can do it from a site perspective, where debris is spread into an area, or we actually can look at it at a site like this, where we're looking at what are the impacts at the site. So starting point, ending point, in both ways, we can analyze this in more detail and visualize it in a product like this, and statistically understand what the potential for these problem areas are. So I think these were just some really great tools that might be useful looking down the road. So to end with, I just wanted to talk about, possibly moving forward here, what's on the horizon, and in my opinion, what would be very useful to do as a starting point here. So I would recommend that, Oregon, California, and Washington continue to work together on debris planning, because we do have some of the shared issues and shared sources, especially the Cascadia subduction zone. We should follow up at the national program level, not only through the sediment and debris modeling workshop, but also look at potential support. Not only the maps, but the models and the videos you can see that kind of tell the story and help the planning process. And then really separating out what you can do beforehand, what you can do during a tsunami and after a tsunami. And before a tsunami, this, creating that plan is essential. Estimating the volumes, types, and impacts using some of these tools are really important and helpful. Evaluating the environmental concerns ahead of time, and possibly using land use strategies to reduce those issues, and estimating the costs and who will help out. The who will help out is really important, and keeping some of that work local would be really useful for the community. And again, stressing this implementing mitigation activities and strategies that reduce the impacts ahead of time and get us to a good place where we know we've done everything we can to really reduce the impacts in the long term. During a tsunami, especially for distant source events, harbors and other locations can shut down infrastructure or move contamination sources or vessels prior to the tsunami's arrival in real time. If there is time for a distant source tsunami, identifying those areas and identifying those problems could be useful. Then after a tsunami, just making sure that plan gets implemented. The funding stream is on course, and then communicating with partners and making sure that all the partners understand what's at stake and finding those gaps that aren't being filled, not only in the plan, but also on the ground. So that's my plug for today on developing guidance and possibly having a work group that helps to work on something like this. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you got something out of it. So I'll just turn it back over to Althea now. Althea, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry. I appreciate everyone's time on this and would like to lead a short conversation about moving forward, but I wanted to know if anyone has any questions. You can drop questions into either the question one or the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions that are popping up. So what I would like to move forward on is if we could maybe talk about having our way forward. If you want to talk, I have given everyone the ability to unmute themselves. It is not letting me unmute you whole hog. So if you have something to recommend, feel free to make that recommendation. Okay, I don't see any questions, and I don't see. So we have one question. What is the expectation for floating debris, and how will it be addressed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that it's a simple answer. I think especially in coastal front areas, if you can reduce that debris potential, if you know that you have that floating debris that's really lightweight, and will obviously be part of the flow, and reducing those, especially if they hold chemicals and other things. I think expectations-wise, I think the Japanese, they tried to collect as much of that material before it got too far offshore, but it got they were so, excuse the word, but they were so inundated by so many other issues that they had to face that it was not one of their priorities. So I think that could be part of a plan, is dealing with that easier, more floating type debris that you have to deal with.
Thank you. There was also another question in the Chile visualization. Can you describe where that coastline is?
Describe the what? Sorry.
Where the coastline is in the Chile visualization.
Yeah, so the coastline is right here where you have the gray and the green area matching or meeting up. So the coast is that gray area is the ocean, and the land is the green area.
Okay. The next question is, will we be able to share the slides and contact of the presenter? Yes. Once I get the recording edited to take out the technical difficulties at the front end, we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel so that it can be shared out. And I will also send out Rick's contact information with his permission.
Yes.
Okay. Another question is there any way to estimate how much of the debris would be contaminated, for example, with oil or chemicals, asbestos?
Yeah, I think there's enough of these tools that can be used that can really identify this, especially if you know what those sources are for that material. So it may take some surveys for a community to find out where those materials are starting from, where they're located. I think, especially for a Cascadia event, where you may get an entire community inundated, those will definitely become debris issues. So having a survey and kind of a summary of those materials ahead of time and where they're located be really important. And I think some of this modeling that I showed, where you see the heat maps and where that material will end up, could be useful too, to know what, not only where those problem areas could start from, but where they could end up.
Okay. So there's another question that they're interested in the heat map by David Lynette. So if we could get his contact, Patrick Lynette, sorry. I was reading the name David. If we could get his contact information as well, and I'll send that out with yours. I think I may have his contact information, but I'll double check.
Well, and I'll double check with him to make sure he's okay with with that, but I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure
if
he
you
will
would.
be.
Okay. So the next question is, how prepared is the U.S. for a massive tsunami event in comparison to Japan?
I don't believe we're at that same level right now. They have had to face these tsunamis multi times each century. So they've got dozens of these tsunamis in their history that have impacted their coastline. So it kind of raises to a higher level of preparedness and understanding. Although I'll have to say, despite the fact that we haven't had an event in over 300 years on Cascadia, I think the work in Oregon and Washington, understanding the Cascadia events, understanding the history and the expectations that what they're going to do, I think are good. I think that the biggest difference I see is the way we probably handle the mitigation side and the pre-planning side. I think the Japanese do a lot of pre-planning, especially for a mitigation in reducing debris and sediment issues with engineering methods. We don't do that as much in the U.S., so but it is something that maybe we should be looking at more closely.
Okay. So the next question is, are the presentations from the Oregon Debris Workshop available online? Yes, we have them on a Google Drive. And when I send out Rick's information, I will send a link to that. I'm in the process of editing the recordings for that. Some of them are a little bit choppy. And that was one of the reasons why we decided to do this series of webinars. So I'm hoping to get the majority of the individuals who did present at that workshop to come back and do these webinars. So are there any more questions?
But and it is partly written, so it's not elemental. But I think, as I kind of mentioned, as we can look, the starting point for me is kind of these different levels of approaches, at least analyzing the tsunami and knowing the communities that are the levels of community involvement. I think one of the biggest things that I got out of the workshop is that, almost every speaker was adding a new section to a chapter in a guidance document with their presentations. So I think that going back to a lot of those presentations that talk
To everyone. but I do have your email, to see if you are interested in participating in this. I don't expect it to be a terribly heavy lift, but there will be some, writing and editing and work involved in it. So we do have some folks stepping forward. That is awesome. I will be getting back to you for about this. Great. I'm going to capture you. I have it here. Folks that are volunteering, that would be great. So if there are no further questions, Rick, do you want to kind of tie this up, and then we can let these people have their afternoon?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Sophie. I do appreciate everybody tuning in and sticking with us here. Yeah, the only thing I would say is, like I said, that Oregon workshop was just fantastic. I think many of the people are probably on the line that were either presenters or there in the room, and I think there's so many lessons to be learned. And I was really happy with the amount of involvement from Oregon, from the community level and all the way to the top. So just thanks, and appreciate that inspiration, and look forward to working with everybody going forward.
Excellent. So I am looking to organize another webinar in January. I have a couple of people in mind, Daniel, that I might approach to do the next webinar in January. So with that, I will let you all go, and you have a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.